today I'm going to give a presentation of our paper, the DefRec, establishing the physical function virtualization to disrupting the reconnaissance of power grid cyber physical infrastructure. And this work is collaborated with my student Jianing Zhuang, Huayu Zhou, as well as Professor Yichun Wu at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So in recent years, we have observed a lot of cyber attacks in the industry control system. And in those environments, we see that attackers can actually use the domain-specific knowledge to introduce the physical damage or physical disruption. And however, let us use the attacks on the nuclear power plant as a little bit more detailed example. This is the first cyber attack that really caused the physical damage in the power system. And here the information that actually taken from the incident report of these attacks. The first step is that attacker tried to establish some of the foothold into the information technology network used by the electricity companies. And to causing some of the physical damage or the physical disruption, we usually using the attacker, for example, here is a short example that they can compromise some of the network packet coming out of the control system and enable some of the remote opening of the circuit breakers, in this case, causing some of the physical disruption. However, the strongest capability the attacker has is the capability to perform some long-term reconnaissance, in this case, more than 6 months. This type of capability not allows the attackers to introduce the outage, but also specifically specify which area I want this outage happening. So, of course, to prevent some penetration into the information networks of the power system, you can use the firewalls and the VPN, but we know that many times this will fail. And in order to disrupting some of the malicious activities, we see research literatures talking about using the intrusion detection system, but leveraging some of the process level characteristics. But this type of approach is sometimes very difficult to prevent physical damage. But what about the reconnaissance stage? We believe that compared to those passive detection, the preemptive preventions that can disrupt in the reconnaissance before adversary starts to inflict the physical damage are highly desirable. Because the attacker can use in different type of vulnerabilities, can use in different type of strategies, but their objective is always the same physical processes. So by preventing the reconnaissance on a critical set of physical data, we believe that it is possible to cover a wide spectrum of attacks, even including some unknown ones. However, there is some research gap to design the practical and efficient anti-reconnaissance approaches, especially based on today's moving target defense mechanism. For example, some of them relies on mimicking the system behavior, but according to the knowledge from the experiences from the other domain, we know that mimicking can be easily detected because it may not fully follow the protocol or the system or network specification. And the honeypot project, like the compot, can simulate the network infrastructure of power system, but they usually based on a static specification of a certain system. But they can be inconsistent to some proprietary implementation that you find in most of the utility companies. Also, those honeypot projects usually don't model the physical process at all. In order to overcome this research gap, we present our research design under this threat model, and this is general communication networks or the isolated communication networks that you can find in most of the industry control system. The system operators at the control centers will remotely monitor and control the sensors or breakers at the field site, of course, with some deployed intelligent devices in the substations. So we assume that attackers can compromise any computing devices connected to these control networks. In other words, we are already assuming that attacker can make the penetration of these isolated networks. And according to the attacker's capability, let's classify the attacks into 3 types. The passive attacks will only monitor the network traffic to obtain the knowledge of power grid's cyber-physical infrastructure, while the proactive attacks will send in some of the probing messages to the end devices, so using the responses to obtain the knowledge of power grid. And active attacks manipulate network traffic, such as delaying, dropping, or the compromising existing network packets to introducing some of the physical damage. Of course, active attacks also including they can directly injecting some of the new packet. So we can see that passive and proactive attacks are common techniques for the reconnaissance, while the active attacks are usually used to issue the attack concept operation and cause the physical damage. So our design objective overall is to disrupt and mislead attackers' reconnaissance based on the passive and proactive attacks, such that their active attacks becomes ineffective. We specify 3 anti-reconnaissance objectives. The first 2 is to focus on the power system cyber infrastructure. That's to significantly delay the passive and the proactive attacks for obtaining the knowledge of their control networks. And for the third one, we want to leverage some intelligently crafted decoy data to mislead adversaries into designing some ineffective attacks. Ineffective here means that even if the attack designed this attack strategy and is successfully executed, they will not introduce the physical damage to the power system. So we hope to use these techniques to ultimately preventing the physical damage from happening. Of course, in this presentation, I will just focus on the third anti-reconnaissance objective, including their design and design ideas, as well as the evaluation. Here's a design overview of design. We call it DefRec. Of course, it means the defend reconnaissance. The DefRec including several security policies to achieving this anti-reconnaissance objective, but it's based on the top of a concept we called PFV. PFV, we name it as a physical function virtualization, that is borrow some of the idea from the network function virtualization. It's different from the mimicking and the simulation. The PFV will constructing the virtual node based on network interaction with real devices, such that those virtual nodes will follow the actual implementation as well as the dynamic behavior of the real devices. We hope to position PFV as a complementary services to existing security approaches, such as honeypot or intrusion detection system. But of course, in this paper, we're just using it for our anti-reconnaissance objective. And this implementation component of the PFV also serving as a trusted computing base for our design. This includes the network controller application, the integrity of edge switches, and we select a few physical devices as a seed device. We will describe that in the next few slides. And also, we trust the communication channels that are connecting those components. So by using the PFV, we will be able to spoof in we will able to spoof in the traffic on behalf of some virtual node. And it will be very, very difficult, if it is not impossible, for the attacker to distinguish the spoofed traffic from the real traffic. Then, on top of the spoofed traffic and using the information contained in the spoofed traffic, we can specify the security policy to disrupt reconnaissance. For example, if this is the power system that the attacker needs to learn to design effective strategy, we will use in some of the spoof traffic to present a different power system to the attacker. But based on this misleading information, the attacker's design will become effective. In the power engineering, most of the time, people using bus to represent a substation or a site, and to using the small arrow to represent a load unit, and this round circle as a generation. So the power system will just try to deliver the generation to the load demand. So let us take a look at some of the detailed components of PFV. Our overall objective is try to use in the interaction of the real devices to building the virtual node. It contains a virtual node template and the profile of the seed devices, as well as the packet hooking component. The virtual node template contains a static configuration of the target control network, such as the IP addresses or the application layer protocol that should be used by the virtual node. And then we selecting some of the physical devices that is used by the power system as a seed device. We'll need to profile the seed device's dynamic behavior. In our paper, will contain certain aspects of those behavior, but the most critical one is the system invariant. That's usually the characteristics that can be used to fingerprint the real devices. Then the packet hooking component was the one that will constructing the outbound traffic of the virtual node. Let's take a look at this small animation here. That is orange circle that's representing the network packet reaching the edge switches. And then the protocol parser will use this header information to determine whether these packets are for the virtual node or not. If it is for the virtual node, then the traffic regulator will forward this packet to a seed device, and seed device will respond. And then we're using the protocol encoder to tailor some of the packet, such as its IP addresses or application layer payload according to the device profile. And then the traffic regulator will send this packet out on behalf of this virtual node. So in this case, we can see that the outbound packet of the virtual node represent not deterministic, but representing the same probability property of the seed devices. So of course, you can see that software-defined networking can really help us to benefit the design benefit our design and implementation. So on top of PFV, we specify a few security policies. The attack misleading here we only describe the attack misleading policy to achieve the third anti-reconnaissance objective. So we craft the decoy. In this policy, we try to craft the decoy data as the application layer payload of the network packet from the virtual node. They need to satisfy two requirements. The first requirement that to mislead adversaries into designing ineffective strategies. The second one is that some of those decoy data need to satisfy the physical model of the power system. So we're using the false data injection attacks as an example, based on the theoretical model presented in the CCS on 2010. And then, for example, in this attack, the attackers need to know the actual topology of power system. For example, if this is a 3-bus system, also used in our paper as a case study. And if they know this accurately knowledge of this power system, they can intelligently compromise the measurement without raising alert in the state estimation. In other words, the measurement errors are less than a detection threshold. However, if we just presenting this different power system, this 4-bus system, and with this misleading information, the attackers will always raise alert in the state estimation. In our case, in our experiment, this measurement errors at least 5,000 times of the detection threshold. In our paper, we also follow the theoretical model to kind of prove that this will always happen. So our evaluation is based on the cyber-physical testbed, and we implemented 6 different types of power systems of different sizes, including this cyber and physical infrastructure. We implement PFV as an SDN application in ONOS, and attack misleading policy in Mad Power. We use physical devices from 3 different vendors in our experiment, from the Schweider Engineering Lab, Adam Bradley, and Schneider Electric. So just highlight a few evaluations. First of all, is the effectiveness of PFV, that is how well the virtual node can follow the behavior of the real devices. We apply the fingerprinting method proposed for CPS, refers to an NDSS 2016 paper, on both physical devices and the virtual node, and specifically using the time that device or virtual node will executing the control command as a system invariant. And then we measure the probability density function of those execution time for both control operation as well as the data acquisition operation. That's 2 most common operations that you can find in the most industry control system. So in these 6 cases, we can see that the virtual node can follow the communication pattern of real devices pretty well, just with some minor differences, less than 2 milliseconds, that you can often find in the jitters due to the devices and the communication. Also, to show the effectiveness of decoy data, we redefine is false negative and false positive. The false negative means that the false data injection attacks based on the decoy data are successful. But a false negative means that this attacks based on the decoy data are successful. But a false positive means that decoy data itself is not valid. So you can draw the suspicion to the attacker. And based on the evaluation that implemented in Mad Power, we actually don't see many false positive and false negative. The only non-zero cases are presented in this figure. We'll see that most of the time the false detection rate are less than 2%. So to conclude my talk, that in this paper we present PFV, that is a physical function virtualization. slightly different than the mimicking and simulation based on the software-defined networking. So we can use the network interaction with real devices to build a virtual node. And then on top of those virtual node, we specified 2 security policies to disrupting the adversaries' reconnaissance of power-grid cyber-physical infrastructures. This including some randomize some of the communications that I didn't describe in details in this presentation, but more details I presented how to craft the decoy data for the virtual node. And we perform both the security and performance evaluation based on the real physical devices as well as the real hardware switches. And in the future work, we'll be interested in defining the formal coverage analysis of PFV as well as its usage in other security functions as well. Thank you.
Abe Clements, Sandia National Labs. How does your approach handle techniques where they actively probe and look for identifiers on the end devices themselves?
Sorry,
So some of these attacks have been known to go in and grab like serial numbers or device model numbers off the controllers that they're attacking. How's your approach handle when they're looking for specific information to authenticate that they're in the right place on the network that are buried deep in these devices?
I don't think I could.
You mentioned the proactive attacks and probing.
Yeah.
He was wondering about how you handle those.
Okay. Because due to the time limitation, we didn't prevent in our evaluation on the probing attacks. For the probing and including the passive and proactive attacks, we mainly disrupting attackers delay their time to obtain obtaining the identities of the real devices of the power system. And in our evaluation, based on our evaluation, we can delay them with, let's say, delay them for 100 years by adding a number of virtual nodes that is equal to 20% of the real devices.
Hi, I'm Álvaro Cárdenas from UC Santa Cruz. So I have a nice presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one is, so the threat model assumes that the attacker hasn't compromised this SCADA server, right? Because that's where the attacker is somewhere in the middle of the network but cannot see the controlling devices or the controlling servers.
Yeah, we're assuming that attacker has already penetrated into these isolated communication networks. Somehow we should assume that they still haven't got the complete knowledge of the control networks of the power system. If they already have obtained identities of real devices through some other channels, then our defense mechanism will not become effective.
Right. No, but I'm wondering, for example, the SCADA server. So the SCADA has to get the real information, right?
Oh, okay. In this case, we're assuming that those legitimate applications already knows identities of real devices. And even if they don't know, actually, on the other end of the communication, let's say on the control center, you can still apply another level of the software controller to filter out. If this software controller knows identity of real devices, they can filter out the traffic of the spoofed traffic on the other end.
Okay. Yeah, right. So the attacker cannot be in the SCADA server, right? He cannot. Okay. Nice. And the second question is, I was wondering, so there are other proposals that try to perturb the physical system, right? This one is not one of those, right? You're not changing the operation of the...
No, I'm not changing. I think what you mentioned is one of the few researchers from the Texas A&M University. They tried to perturbing the physical component of the power system, and then based on the deviation of the expected consequences to detect attacks. Yeah, we did cite in their works in our paper, but this is different. We don't change any physical configuration. We don't change in the control center operation. We don't change in the substation's configuration. And you can see we only use an SDN as the edge of the communication networks. So we even don't change any backbone wide area networks used in the control networks.
Okay, so there's no overhead in the physical system. The physical system doesn't degrade at all, but
no.
Can you maybe quickly comment on the overhead that this implemented?
Oh, we performed the overhead in 2 aspects. The first aspect is the overhead of the communication networks because we did spoofing some of the traffic. So there are a little bit more traffic on the communication networks, but that overhead is usually ignorable, as we don't need to. Because of this misleading information, we don't rely on the large number of virtual nodes to disrupt in reconnaissance. And secondly, is that based on there's an overhead of the crafting of decoy data. So the crafting of decoy data takes some time, especially is overhead will increase based on the size of the power system. But we find that it's on the same scale of most of the power system application. In other words, if in the future there's a more advanced technology proposed for the power systems analysis or this type of algorithm, our decoy data, the overhead can also be reduced. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Jared Smith from Oak Ridge National Lab. I just had a question about how you identify adversaries. Do you make an assumption that when the traffic comes in, you know who is malicious and who is benign? Because that wasn't entirely clear.
Actually, we don't. For example, in the passive attack, the attacker actually didn't need to do anything. So in this case, we actually don't have awareness of the adversaries. But in the proactive attack, it is possible because attackers sending the probing messages. We detecting this type of probing based on a new protocol, which we call the probabilities dropping protocol. That is more details on the paper, but we didn't present it here in the.
Yeah, really advanced adversaries that target these grids. Like I know this from the work I do at National Lab are like they will not be seen, like they will not be distinguishable from a normal person. So I just suggest really looking at the more advanced adversaries rather than just probing, because they're not going to sit there and probe and then get discovered.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks.